It is the glory of God to conceal things, but the glory of kings is to search things out. That's what it tells us in Proverbs 25:2. At For the New Christian Intellectual, we believe in searching out the truth wherever it is to be found. Welcome to week 25 of the Objectivism book study. I'm Cody Leibold, and we are in chapter 8 of Objectivism, the philosophy of Ayn Rand. It is pages 276 to 303. Today we're looking at Ayn Rand's understanding of the virtues of justice and productiveness. We can read this with an eye toward how Christians in particular can benefit from the thought of Ayn Rand on these moral topics. Productive work, writes Rand, is the central purpose of a rational man's life, the central value that integrates and determines the hierarchy of all his other values. Justice is the recognition of the fact that every man must be judged for what he is and treated accordingly. So let's go to the book. It's a large reading this week. When I was looking on the topic of justice, I realized this has a huge implication for the church, because much of what FTNCI has been trying to advocate publicly about this is right, this is wrong, don't be a moderate, that is what is being thrown away by the church right now, and we need to rediscover the willingness to evaluate men according to what they are. Page 276, Peikoff writes justice as rationality in the evaluation of men. Justice is the virtue of judging men's character and conduct objectively and acting accordingly, granting to each man that which he deserves. So that's not a contentious point, that's just what justice means, granting to each person what they deserve. So we're talking about rationality in our evaluation of men, and that's what distinguishes this from, say, rationality more generally. Peikoff writes that you have to know the things around you and you have to judge them rationally. That's the issue here. The necessity of knowledge and judgment is especially important in regard to men because the differences among them are more consequential than among shirts, sofas, or parks. That's why we have a special category. He writes on the next page, to be able to deal properly with men, it is essential that one determine their relationship to the laws of morality. It is essential that one pronounce moral judgment. So judging the moral status of another person is a pretty complex thing, because first of all, you have to know what your moral code is. Then you have to ask yourself whether this other person is conforming to that moral code correctly. So you're judging his judgments. So it's a meta thing. Next part, he writes, moral judgment distinguishes the men who choose to recognize reality from the men who choose to evade it. When you make a moral judgment about another person, is this a reality-oriented judgment? The way that you determine that is you ask yourself, is the other person reality-oriented? So you're judging whether they're judging. That's what you're doing here. And you can make a reality-based judgment about another person, about whether they are making reality-based judgments. If a man is good by the objectivist standard, Peikoff writes, one can expect to gain values in dealing with him. And that's the point. That's the reality-oriented point here, is that from the point of view of my life and my values, I need to know where you stand in relation to values. Peikoff writes, the policy of pronouncing moral judgment is like a policy of human prospecting while wearing a bulletproof vest. Notice the rational self-interest premise here. It is a process of methodically seeking out and cherishing the virtuous traits one needs in others, such as effort, courage, idealism, while being alert to the opposites of these traits and to their destructive potential. The man who adopts a policy of moral neutrality, if you skip ahead, it says he becomes an ally of evil in the sense of leaving evil uncensured and unopposed, free to continue in its course of destruction. We want to have friends and we want to have associates in our lives that are positively oriented toward our values and that are also oriented negatively against disvalues. We want associates that will censure evil, that will not accept evil, that will not be moderates paving the road for evil. The refusal to judge, like any kind of agnosticism, Peikoff writes, is itself the taking of a stand, in this case a profoundly immoral stand. So this is interesting. We expect of our associates that they judge. It's dangerous if your associates do not judge evil. A summary from Rand, when your impartial attitude declares in effect that neither the good nor the evil may expect anything from you, whom do you betray and whom do you encourage? So long as men have to make moral choices, there is no escape from moral values. So long as moral values are at stake, no moral neutrality is possible. To abstain from condemning a torturer is to become an accessory to the torture and murderer of his victims. This is a common theme throughout what I've read in moral philosophy, almost like a maxim. Your silence in the face of evil could be complicity, it could be capitulation, it could be assisting the evil if you just remain silent. How clear is that in today's moral discussions? For example, we have just yesterday found out that Roe v. Wade and Casey versus whatever it was were both overturned by the Supreme Court. How many Christians are there? They're celebrating today, but then there are other Christians or purported Christians that are downplaying the goodness of this ruling by the Supreme Court, or that are trying to change the subject onto, okay, well, therefore we need more socialism because our work is only partly done until we have a socialist utopia. It's frustrating to watch this battle play out, but you can see the role moral judgment has in this battle. And for example, in the church has been elevating leaders that have this Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, ERLC type attitude toward abortion. The church has been elevating people that have been saying, let's make abortion unthinkable. But they're not saying, let's make it illegal, punishable, criminal. And so you elevate people like that and you don't morally judge them. You don't have expectations on them, but you fund them. And then you get an SBC, a Southern Baptist Convention like we have today. The trouble is at every step of the way, who do you morally judge as being worthy of your support? Do you donate money to your pastor, and your pastor is willing to say that abortion is a moral evil, but he's not willing to say that it should be criminal? That's what Albert Mohler was saying up until about this year. That's what Denny Burke was saying last month, was that we don't want to criminalize women having abortions. The point is, if you do not judge people, eventually wicked people or people that are morally incompetent come to dominate the landscape. And there are consequences to surrounding yourself with people like this. Interactions on those points before we go forward?
You can and should morally evaluate the actions of people that you're aware of without needing to comment on the rest of their lives or on the state of their soul as a whole. You can draw inferences about the state of their soul from some of their actions. And there, Jesus is saying is relevant that you shall know them by their fruit, right? If there's evil, unrepentant action, then you've got a pretty good inference to the fact that they have evil souls, because evil souls are producing evil fruit. But you don't have to say with certainty that they are unregenerate or they are not Christian. And you don't have to say anything about how they act in other parts of their lives, how they act with their children, or how they act with their families at home in private, or whatever the case might be, in order to say what he did right here is wicked and morally condemnable, right? So, and I think one of the things that makes people hesitate to draw moral judgments about especially public actions is they think, and a lot of people try to tell them, that you can only make a moral judgment about somebody if you're willing to say that that moral judgment applies to their entire soul and to the entirety of everything they ever done in their entire lives. And that's just asinine. And that destroys the ability to make any moral judgment, good or bad, because you never have the epistemic access to those other things in order to say one way or the other, good or bad, about the entire soul and about their entire life. So you have to treat it as contextual in the sense of being applicable to what you're currently perceiving, being applicable to the thing that you are presently speaking about, and not necessarily being applicable to things that you're not speaking about or things that you don't have any access to right now.
What you're saying reminds me of when people in evangelical leadership, when they will say, oh, it's impossible that this person did this bad thing because I know they did these 10 other good things. They've always been a good person. They're my friend. This argument of they can't be a bad person because they're my friend, or they can't have done this bad thing because they're my friend. It's like, no, that's not what we're talking about here. But you're right. That's all connected. Yeah, Jennifer, go ahead.
That reminds me of, when I advocate for a system like capitalism, of course, I get called heartless and without compassion, which is like the opposite of who I am as a person. I'm very compassionate and generous and kind. And so to hear, Jacob, when you're talking about, narrowing the focus on this instance or on this participation of this thing, that's kind of hard for me because we don't know the whole person. Some people at work, they kind of have to be like a pretty abrasive person or a direct person, but outside of work, that's not them. And so it's hard, I think, to be able to just say in this instance, this is who they are. versus this is what they do would make more sense. And some people don't see the nuance, the difference between those two things.
Yeah, and you can still, like, you can say, all right, this person did this bad thing and it was immoral for them to do this. And therefore, in that sense, they are immoral. They are immoral in that they chose to do this evil thing. But that doesn't have to mean that everything else they've ever done in their life and everything else they will do is also immoral. You're making a moral judgment about their character, but you're limiting it to in respect to the thing that you're talking about, the action that they took, the part of their character that allowed them to make that action in that particular case.
Judging other people is one of the most challenging things. And so when something like this comes about, you can look at it and you can say, I think that what they did there was immoral, an evil choice, or just a lazy choice. And when all those things happen, it's one data point. We know that we all have a sin nature and that we all make different kinds of mistakes at different times. And we have to account for the fact that we don't have all the facts. To some extent, our moral judgments have to be contingent on further facts, on hearing the reasons. Before you would judge somebody, you'd want to talk to them about what were the reasons why this happened. All right, let's go forward in the reading. Only the good, Ayn Rand writes elsewhere, can lose by a default of justice, and only the evil can profit. Oh, and Jacob had also left this comment in the chat there. He says, all that is needed for evil to prosper is for good men to do nothing. That points to the fact that we must judge. And so you connect that with what Rand is saying here. Only the good can lose by a default of justice. Only the evil can profit. This is a huge part of John Galt's speech. Understanding the consequence of putting a little evil in with the good. Go ahead, Jacob.
This is a little bit of a follow-up to what we were just talking about, but I think it's going to apply to everything else that gets discussed. Notice that the people who want to say, no, you can't say something about someone's character in this instance because you don't know what's going on in the rest of their lives, they won't apply the same standard if it's about saying something good about that person. If you're praising someone, they're not going to say, no, you can't do that because you don't know if they're faithful in the rest of their lives. But if you say something morally condemning of that person, they'll say, no, you can't do that. You don't know if they're immoral in the rest of their lives. They don't really care about the fact that you don't know the other facts about the rest of their lives. What these objectors care about is the stifling of condemning evil. They are desperate not to allow condemnation of evil.
You can see that also when they praise somebody like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and they say, well, she did one or two good things, and then they overlook the publicly available facts about the bad things, or the positions that she took that were evil. It's like they only want to praise. They only want to praise those people that really ought not to be praised. You don't see them going about saying like, well, Donald Trump had this one thing that he did right. They would never do that. It's a posturing thing. They want to show how righteous they are because they're able to sort out between the wheat and the chaff when it comes to the wicked. But only when it comes to the wicked, because that's the only... And I think it's related to the altruism thing, pathological altruism. It's like, well, this person's not a value, therefore I can demonstrate how virtuous I am by trying to find just a tiny bit of value in them. Because it's counterintuitive, therefore it must be right. This whole assumption that morality is the opposite of what's rational. All right, let's go on now. Justice works to sustain all the men who think and who support human existence while chastening and counteracting their antipodes. So justice is this policy of preserving those who preserve life, identifying them and preserving them. It requires a process of thought, the opposite of what we've seen. It is allegiance to those who have sworn allegiance to life. So again, we see this idea of it being a meta type of a thing. Now, he's going to compare the objectivist theory of justice, which I completely endorse, to what is the conventional understanding of Christian teaching here. The objectivist position is the opposite of the injunction, judge not that ye be not judged. In our policy, in Ayn Rand's words, judge and be prepared to be judged. If man's life is one's standard, one must identify the moral status of every person, issue, and event within the field of his concerns. He goes on and he points out there will be mixed cases in which you should sanction only that which is good. Like when I evaluate Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or something like that, I might say, I appreciate that they built this thing. And then I might say, I don't like that they did this other thing or said this other thing. But now let's look at this idea. Judge and be prepared to be judged is Rand's viewpoint, whereas Jesus has very clearly said, judge not that ye be not judged. But if you read Matthew 7 and you read the rest of that passage, you'll see that he gives us directions on how to judge. And so That phrase, taken out of context, can easily mean you're never supposed to judge. But in context, it means watch out when you go to judge, because there are some cases where you need to be careful because whatever measure you use is going to be used against you. And we have a video about that already at FTNCI. It's not too difficult for Christians that are understanding the Bible, that have been reading the Bible much and thought about it much. Peikoff's perspective and Rand's is compatible with the Christian view. If you take the Bible seriously, it's not compatible with a lot of the platitudes of the preachers.
Yeah, I think you're right that if you view that quote from Jesus in context, it's clear that he basically means exactly what Rand means there. He's not actually saying, don't judge, because if you do, you'll be judged. He's warning, be careful how you judge, because the standard by which you judge is the standard by which you will be judged. He's asserting justice. He's asserting that justice is going to be executed. And if you use a wicked standard, you will be judged accordingly. And again, if you look at the passage in context, he then gives criteria for how to judge, talking about you will know them by their fruit, how to judge false teachers and false brothers and things like that. So he's giving you instructions on how to judge in the context of you better be careful how you judge. So be careful how you judge. Here's the right way to judge.
Page 279, we read, intellectually, justice consists in the use of reason to reach one's moral estimates. So remember, with all of these virtues, he talks about the intellectual component and then the component in action, how it plays out in your actions. The intellectual side of judging, if you were to compare this idea, using reason to reach your moral estimates, compare it to what you see on Reformed Twitter or Southern Baptist Twitter. Let's read what he says here. The just man follows the same epistemological principles as a scientist. He is ruled by the same single-minded concern to discover the truth. First, you must identify the facts of a given case. Then you must evaluate them by reference to objective moral principles. Now, I've had a discussion with somebody who was going around saying that Bart Barber, who was recently elected SBC president, that he was a good man. Now, I've seen enough of what Bart Barber does over the years to know that he's not a good man, not an honest man, as not a fair-minded man, as a man who is trying to bring liberalism into the Southern Baptist Convention, trying to apologize for evil. But then we get these conservatives apologizing for Bart Barber. So we have somebody not being reality-oriented, and then we have other people not being reality-oriented in their judgment of that man. When I brought it to their attention, I said, hey, you should not be saying that he is a good man. In a private conversation with this other person who had praised Bart Barber, the guy said, well, you don't understand. It will be politically bad for us if we don't. And that was his justification. And I said, could we just talk about whether or not he's a good man, not the consequences of saying it? Let's just talk for a moment about whether he's a good man, whether this is true. The Reformed Twitter is incompetent on this issue and immoral on this issue. And I saw it clearly. It's a black and white thing. There are people who will say we should lie, or we should base our decisions about what we're going to say or not say, not on an evaluation of the facts, but on the evaluation of what we think is politically necessary. And that attitude is not going to change the Southern Baptist Convention. And that's why I predict continued losses by conservatives. Go ahead, Jacob.
I think that's excellent political analysis of the current Reformed, the state of the Reformed world in evangelicalism and of SBC in particular, to head off a potential objection on this issue. You know, say you've got special private knowledge of this guy, of Bart Barber being a good guy. Maybe you've got private history with him between your family and his family, or something of the kind. It still would be inappropriate and immoral to publicly say that he is a good guy in response to the controversies he's created, Bart Barber's created, through the wicked things he's said publicly. If Bart Barber is doing and saying evil things publicly, and then privately being a good guy, it would be appropriate for you to say to somebody in private, maybe, hey, I've got some private experience with him and he's good on these things. It might even be appropriate in public to say, in spite of his evil things that he's doing in public, I've got some history with him where I can testify that he's good in other areas. That might be appropriate too. But to leave that distinction out, and to just, in response to his public wickedness, publicly say, no, he's a good guy, is to imply to everybody else in the public, who all they have access to, remember, think about the epistemological context here. All everybody in public has access to is Bart Barber's public actions. So when you say he's a good guy and you don't say that you're talking about some private thing, all we're able to hear is that you are referencing his public actions, which are actually wicked. And that's what's being communicated. That's by necessity, that's what's being communicated. You can't get around that. You have to pay attention to the epistemological context that's being spoken into, especially when we're talking about public speech.
It goes back to the idea of objectivity in communication. It's not objective to make an accusation when there is no evidence, especially if it's the kind of accusation where, like, somebody says this person raped this person. And imagine there's only the witness and it happened 15 years ago and there was no other person that was aware of it at the time. That's not objectivity in communication to go and make an accusation, because how is anybody to judge? All you've done is besmirched a reputation and left everybody helpless to evaluate whether or not you're lying. Likewise with making claims that somebody is morally good. If you want to make a claim that somebody is morally good despite whatever mistake they made, then you need to be able to show the evidence that they're morally good and actually show people why you came to the conclusion that you did. That's objectivity in communication.
I just wanted to mention how this theme throughout Rand's philosophy, honoring reality, like when you are very selective in what you choose to judge as moral or immoral, to selectively omit parts of it is an evasion of reality, and it never works out well. Like, I cannot think of times where somebody goes about life evading reality and have that work out well for them.
I agree. Any kind of evasion, whether it's they're lying about themselves, whether they're not willing to say the truth that they ought to be willing to identify about somebody else. Any other thoughts about that? Okay, let's go forward. So in the process of justice, writes Peikoff, one must begin as a juror, struggling to grasp the facts. Now, this is one of the reasons why it's a temptation to not have a just attitude. I think that it's not always easy and it's not always pleasant when you're confronted with some, like, say there's a discussion about some issue that has happened. And you realize I could have an opinion right now, or I could take a step back and say to myself, I need to struggle to understand this a little bit more. I need to take the view that maybe there's more to this than meets the eye. I might need to wait, be patient, I need to do some work. None of that comes natural to a person. So he says you need to actually develop this as a matter of your character, as a habit mentally, is I am willing to acknowledge my lack of knowledge. I'm willing to become this juror struggling to grasp the facts. And then he talks about this blindfolded statue. This is a good symbol. There's two parts to the symbol. There's the statue is holding a balance. So that's showing that there's objectivity. Whatever a person does, that will dictate the response to that person. If a person does something evil, then that will dictate that they are punished. But then also the other part of the symbol is the statue of justice is wearing a blindfold. The scale is the thing that matters. The scale is the only thing that matters. Nothing else that I see, like, for example, the color of their skin or other facts that make me like this person, dislike this person, nothing else is taken into consideration. I'm intentionally being blind about non-relevant facts, only attending to relevant facts. That is why we have this symbol of justice. So the blindfold shuts out feelings detached from facts. Going on, in general, in life as in law, a person is to be regarded as innocent of wrongdoing until proven guilty. Next page. If one wants only to buy a quart of milk, therefore no special assessment of a grocer is indicated. We don't have to morally judge that every single person that we interact with financially is a good person. It's not our job to do that. And also, it's impossible to make a case that your moral code demands of you that you never pay $5 for a loaf of bread or a meal or whatever it is until you go through all that process of morally evaluating other people. And even if you came to the conclusion that they were just morally gray, which means a combination of black and white, there's no moral principle that can tell you you have to starve in order to not pay them money to get food. It's context here, common sense. Peikoff writes, moral judgment does not include psychologizing. This is another interesting point. Psychologizing meaning instead of just evaluating the action, we're going to go and we're going to evaluate, like, how did the person become the way they did? What happened in their childhood in order to get them to be this kind of person? It's irrelevant to the kind of judgment that we're talking about here. Psychologizing is a common tactic for bullies in debates to say, oh, well, you're a wicked person, rather than saying that's a wicked claim. And let's talk about your claim. Let's talk about how you became the kind of person that you are. It's manipulative. All right, so we go on. Peikoff writes that a man's psychological problems are his concern. not other people's, unless he allows his problems to materialize in the form of overt irrationality, in which case it is the overt behavior that others must observe and judge. So the proper question is, what does a man say and do now? We can talk about the facts. Notice the reality-orientedness of this policy. Let's go to the middle of 281. When judging men, one must bear in mind that there can be no universal estimate. Okay, what does he mean here? I have to keep on reading to get the context here. He says, since the moral is the volitional, there is no rule to the effect that all men are good or evil or mixed. So by universal estimate, he means you cannot meet 5 evil people and then therefore draw the hasty generalization, all men are evil. He says that would not be logical. So don't commit the hasty generalization, or another word for that is, in this case, the fallacy of composition, which is to say, I've observed a couple and I'm going to generalize about all. The hasty generalization, if you're not sure what that means, imagine if somebody were to go over to a car and he were to look at the tire of the car and he were to say that the tire is made out of rubber. Therefore, the whole car is made out of rubber. There's a different kind of fallacy that's the opposite direction, the fallacy of division. You know a generalization about the whole and then you apply it illicitly to the parts. So it's good to have those terms in mind because you're going to see this kind of thing done all the time as you're trying to discuss moral issues. It's not a good idea to say you observed 5 people that have white skin to say all white-skinned people are bad, or black skin, or any other skin. You have to be careful when you make generalizations. You shouldn't conclude that all men are morally evil based on some observations. You also shouldn't conclude that they're all morally good. He says you should not whitewash. You should not take this idea that he calls universal middle of the roadism. Everyone's a little evil and everyone's a little good. These kinds of generalizations are not logical in any direction. Some people would say there's some good in the worst of us, and then there's some bad in the best of us. And what they're doing is nihilistic because they're refusing to celebrate the heroic in the heroic. They're refusing to condemn that which is antithetical to life in the evil. That's the problem. He points out that gray is a mixture of black and white. If you want to be reality-oriented, you must recognize that which is actually the black and actually the white. Next page, he's talking about this process of justice. And he says there is no greater obstacle to a process of justice than the theory of altruism. Altruism inverts moral judgment, and I think this accounts for the insane state of the world today and the insane state of people's treatment of issues of justice. He says altruism inverts moral judgment, teaching people to admire self-sacrifice and belittle self-preservation as amoral or worse. Then, since the theory cannot be practiced consistently, it leads people to hate the very fact of moral judgment. Moral estimates, such people explain, are cruel. A good man is not really good but lucky, while an evil man or a group is not really evil. He couldn't help it. They don't mean it. In any political crisis that's going on in the world today, do you not see this? At the same time, since morality cannot be avoided and since consistent altruism is impossible, the theory prompts people, when they do judge, to condemn everybody indiscriminately. All these policies, moral inversion, moral neutrality, sweeping condemnation, they defy the virtue of justice. It's all an issue of illogic. Saying good when it's not, saying bad when it's not. And this is consistent with what the Bible teaches. We should not be saying that good is evil or that evil is good. Woe to you if you do. Any reaction to that before we go forward? Bottom of the page, in Atlas Shrugged, we read, justice is the act of acknowledging that which exists. Injustice, like all vices, is a form of evading reality, consists in faking the character not of nature but of men. Justice, in the realm of action, consists in granting to each man that which he deserves. Okay, so this is just a matter of dictionary definition. To deserve is to become worthy of recompense, for example, a reward or a punishment, according to the good or the evil of character or conduct. A reward is a value given to a man in payment of his virtue or achievement. A punishment is a disvalue inflicted in payment for vice or fault. Now, Peikoff explains justice in action consists in requiting the positive, the good, in men with a positive, and the negative with a negative. He agrees with the Old Testament principle, an eye for an eye. Now, we've heard people use cheesy bumper sticker slogans like, an eye for an eye leaves everyone blind. But if you follow this policy of not judging and not punishing people for wickedness, you get a society like the one that we have today, where not taking an eye for an eye leaves millions of criminals, an increasing number of criminals. Those are our options. Do you want to live in a world with an increasing number of criminals?
It's also not true that an eye for an eye leaves everybody blind, unless you assume that every single individual is going to take the eye of an innocent person.
Right.
That's the only way in which an eye for an eye would leave everybody blind. So again, that's that sweeping generalization that is just false.
Now, this idea of requiting evil for evil is something that we need to treat with care, and objectivism has its understanding of how you do that. For example, you cannot just go initiate force or respond in force like a vigilante. Objectivism says that there's the rule of law, and that's the purpose of the rule of law, is to keep there from being this kind of vigilante justice. And in the Bible, we see the same idea, that you would take it to the elders of the city gate, or that you take it to the judge or to the king, and that you would plead your case publicly so that there could be objectivity in judgment. At the bottom of the page, the retributivists in the history of philosophy declare that the man must be recompensed for his actions independent of their consequences. He must be recompensed as an absolute, simply because he deserves a certain treatment. That's the intrinsicist attitude. And then he contrasts that with the subjectivists, the utilitarians. They currently control our criminal justice system. They reply that there are no absolutes and that the decision to reward or punish has to be based on probable consequences. So we do a statistical analysis of what happens when murderers get this punishment versus that punishment, and then that will determine whether or not this punishment is to be given. He rejects both of those anti-objective approaches. Middle of this page, 284, he says, let's look now at the question, what rewards and punishments do men deserve to receive from one another? And the answer is precisely what each man's rational self-interest requires that he give. He writes, since morality is man's mode of power, there is no spiritual reward one can offer as consequential as one's moral sanction, no spiritual deprivation as harsh as withholding it. This is something that we need to steward as Christians. Steward your moral sanction. He writes at the bottom of the page here, justice consists first not in condemning, but in admiring. So that's an interesting point, and it's novel to objectivism. It's more important in your life that you would praise the good than that you would condemn the evil. He says it consists first not in condemning, but in admiring and in one's admiration explicitly, and fighting for those that one admires, acknowledging the good intellectually, and then defending it. Now, if you were to compare this idea to the modern trend of social justice, this is actually a point where I agree with the social justice advocates. Now, they have an entirely Marxist, irrational view of what justice consists of. But one point that they do make is that justice involves caring about the innocent. Not just punishing the guilty, but also looking at what's going on to the innocent. Being a champion publicly of those who are good or those who are deserving of something. Now, their theory is that need constitutes a claim, and that therefore we should publicly champion those who are in need, and we should call them the good, and they are the oppressed. Therefore, if there's anybody that's in need, therefore there is oppression. That's not the theory that I have or that Rand has, but I agree with him that we should actually have a positive approach to justice, which is we should look at those who are deserving of something, and we should advocate for them. And that's something that, as a Christian, if you hear the social justice advocates, as a Christian, if you respond to them and you say, I reject your thing because we don't need to be publicly championing justice. It's like, you're crazy. You're going to lose the debate immediately if you don't understand this point. R.C. Sproul is an example of somebody that got this point. He said, I agree with the social justice advocates that we should be advocating for justice. Let's go to the next page, 285. It is important to tell Kant that he has rejected reality and is wrong. It is more important that Aristotle finds someone who understands that he has recognized reality and is right. And I want to point out that I think that what FTNCI is trying to do is we're trying to be the people that come around and say, hey, Ayn Rand was right about a lot of these things. What FTNCI is doing is attempting to be an act of justice toward Ayn Rand and toward the truth that she has advocated. We want people to see this, and we think that they haven't. So we are, in this case, following the advice. We're being champions of the just and champions of that which is good in Ayn Rand.
Let me add to that, not just Ayn Rand, but Thomas Jefferson, John Locke, Thomas Aquinas, Aristotle, and everybody in between who would be a part of the classical school of thought leading up to Rand, and whom we would look to as intellectual and moral heroes in various respects throughout history. Many of those people are shunned and condemned, especially within Reformed evangelicalism. And we are trying to be advocates for their ideas and for what they stood for and what they accomplished.
This page says, Atlas Shrugged is a model to follow. It's a historic act of justice. I agree with that. He goes on, he says, insofar as one has a choice, one must boycott evil men and nations. So there's a good principle there. And now this is a voluntary principle. I don't think that the federal government should be prohibiting us from importing Cuban cigars unless Cuba is a military threat to us currently. But I think that we should consider where we're buying our things. And to the extent that it's not self-sacrifice, you should choose to buy from virtuous people. Top of the next page, 286, justice does not require that a man volunteer unsolicited denunciations to random individuals. There is, however, one situation in which man must speak out, when his own convictions are attacked in his presence and his silence would imply his endorsement. You just say, I do not agree. You don't have to go into a rant. You don't have to make a scene. Middle of the page, what does justice consist of? When one man seeks a value from another, it just means following the trader principle. I should mention, earlier he brought up this issue of, well, how do you know? Say somebody did something that was criminal. How do you know what the proper response is? This is not something that philosophy in itself answers. It is somewhat connected to the social situation. 200 years ago or 150 years ago, if you stole a man's horse, you would get the death penalty, and now you wouldn't. That's partly because the conditions of life are different now. If you stole someone's horse in the old days, you might have stranded somebody very far away from where they could find food. You might have been actually condemning them to death if you stole their horse. This is just not the case today. And so sometimes the punishments of the law change because the logic of the situation has changed. And that's something that if you look at the debate about theonomy, we often discuss the issue of different punishments in the Old Testament compared to what we would advocate for today. The situation has changed. And when the situation changes, the punishments change. That doesn't mean that justice is subjective. That means that it's based on reality. What facts of reality give rise to the need for this kind of punishment? There's a whole field of the philosophy of law that is needed to address this in fine detail, which we can't get into here. Generally speaking, the historical approach, which is that some people can merit the death penalty, some people can merit having to pay back something which they destroyed or damaged or stole. That's fair. And I also would note that there is, in the debate in the United States today, there's this discussion about whether or not we should have a reform of our prison system. If you look in the Old Testament, you actually don't see God telling the Israelites to put people in jail for their crimes. It's you either pay it back or you die, or you perhaps banishment from the nation. Those are the kinds of punishments that we see. And there's a case to be made that perhaps we should not have prisons, maybe a jail for when somebody has committed a crime and then they need to receive a ruling, but not prison as a punishment after the ruling. Just a thought. All right, let's go to the next section here. Peikoff writes that the exponent of justice is the man who gives in return for what he receives and who expects to receive in return for what he gives. He's the man who neither seeks something for nothing nor grants something for nothing. This trader principle will come up in our social theory more generally, but this is where it comes from. It comes from an understanding of justice. The trader principle states that if a man seeks something from another, he must gain title to it, come to deserve it by offering the appropriate payment. The two men accordingly must be traders, exchanging value for value by mutual consent. That's the key issue. To mutual benefit. It's the principle of ownership and the principle of consent, the principle of not initiating force. Next page, since the individual's mind is the basic creator of values, and since man is not a sacrificial animal, the individual has a right to demand payment for his values. Nor does any man or group have a right to override this right. Leaving aside the claims of children on their parents, no person by the mere fact of his existence or his needs has a claim on the assets of others. Peter Schwartz has a book just recently out in the last year or two called The Tyranny of Need. I'd recommend reading that. This is one of the key issues shaping our society today, the misunderstanding of need constituting a claim. If need constitutes a claim, then you're going to have communism. You're going to have some commissar that tells you who owes what to whom. Middle of the page here, in a rational philosophy, there is no unearned desert. A man deserves from others that and only that which he earns. So the way I look at it, to say that somebody has not earned something is exactly the same thing as saying that person does not deserve the thing. There are exceptions to that. Like, for example, let's say your parents had their house dispossessed from them, and then later on somebody comes back and says, hey, let's look at this case, and they reevaluate the case. And they say, this was an injustice. Now we're going to give that house back to the descendants. Okay, so that's a case because it's a child relationship where they deserve something, but they have not themselves earned it. But aside from cases like that, and actually there's one case like that in the Old Testament with the Gibeonites. Remember, some injustice was done to them, and then years later, they are restored back to whatever property or land that they had. The point, though, is that for the most part, earn and deserve are the same thing. So you do not deserve free handouts from the government. You do not earn them. This is an issue if you ever discuss it with the social justice warriors. They're not going to understand this distinction. They're going to think that people can deserve something without having earned it. And so that's a key point that we need to be willing to discuss with them. Now we go on. Since there is no value without virtue, there is, in Ayn Rand's words, no escape from justice. Nothing can be unearned and unpaid for in the universe. So somebody's going to pay for it. If you're giving away free houses to people in need, somebody else is paying for those houses. Peikoff writes that the innocent should pay is the demand of those who reject the trader principle. Such people claim that values are the product of God or society, to which power they add the individual owes unconditional service. In this view, certain men, such as the needy, become deserving in a new invalid definition of the term. They deserve to receive values simply because they lack and wish for them, as a recompense for no action, as a payment for no achievement. And that is what social justice today means, is the tyranny of need. Let's go to the next page, 288. Compare that with the trader principle, which prohibits looting, which prohibits mooching. The same principle applies in the spiritual realm. A man must deserve what he seeks from others as far as his friendship, as far as love. Love, writes Ayn Rand, is the expression of one's values, the greatest reward you can earn for the moral qualities that you have achieved in your character and person, the emotional price paid by one man for the joy he receives in the virtues of another. Love, as a response to a person's value, is an acknowledgement of facts. Peikoff writes, as such, it has a moral meaning for both parties. It imposes a double responsibility. The lover must be rational, and so must the beloved. And you contrast this. Okay, now Peikoff is going to contrast this with Christianity again. It's almost like objectivism is partly a response to Marxism and it's partly a response to Christianity. It's like a polemic against both of them. But let's talk about what he says. Contrast this approach, Peikoff writes, with one upheld in the Sermon on the Mount. We should, Jesus tells us, love our neighbors regardless of desert, apart from their character, because of their vices. This is love not as a payment for joy, but as self-sacrifice, not as recompense to the good, but as a blank check to the evil, not as an act of loyalty to existence, but as the deliberate rejection of man's life. Okay. When Jesus said, turn the other cheek, he had a purpose. When Jesus' own cheek was struck when he stood before the high priest, he protested and said that that's an act of injustice. When Paul was struck before the high priest, he said, you whitewashed a tomb. Both Paul and Jesus protested when they were struck on the cheek, even though they both believed in the teaching of Jesus that you should turn the other cheek when you're struck. What does that mean for Christians? It means that it's not so simple as the conventionalists have made it. There's a purpose in going the extra mile, turning the other cheek, or giving to the one who asks you. And the purpose is to win their heart. And in some cases to be a good witness, and in some cases to be a peacemaker. But what Jesus is telling us is not that we should value other people irrationally. That cannot be true. Jacob, you've explained this in relation to 1 Corinthians 13. If I have not love, then I'm just a clanging cymbal.
Yeah, in fact, Paul says, even if I give my body to the flames and give all that I have to the poor and have not love, it profits me nothing. So even if you do the supposedly loving actions, but you don't have love, meaning that love is a feeling or an affection, value is what we would call it, then it profits you nothing. You're doing it for profit. Paul's implicit motive is profit. And Jesus's implicit motive throughout the Gospels is profit, is gain, is seeking that which is ultimately best. And just like in Atlas Shrugged, the strikers are instructed by John Galt and others, turn the other cheek, so to speak, by giving up their property, by giving up their lives, by giving up their wealth, by turning away from everything that is rightfully theirs. They do it for a purpose, like you said, Cody. They've got a greater goal in mind. It's not sacrifice as an end in itself. It's not morally praising that which is not morally praiseworthy. It's a correction. It's a correction because of a sinful and corrupt and wicked context that you found yourself in. And the only way to save the ultimate values that you hold is to renounce some of the values that you hold that have been corrupted by that wickedness. I find Atlas Shrugged to be a very great parallel to many of the calls to supposed sacrifice that we see in the New Testament and supposed turning of the cheek and things like that. It's for a reward. It's for a purpose. There's a self-interested, rational, just aim in mind. To a certain extent, I can't blame Rand and Peikoff for having Christianity in their sights, for Objectivism being a polemic against Christianity and Marxism at the same time, because they see Christianity as aiding and abetting Marxism. To a certain extent, they can't be blamed for that because most Christians do drop that overall context when they read the Bible, especially when they read the New Testament. They drop the context of Jesus going to the cross for the joy set before him. They drop the context of God doing everything for his own glory. They drop the context of you being called to follow Jesus in sacrifice for the sake of saving your soul, for the sake of eternal reward. They drop the context of that ultimate rational self-interest. And they turn the Bible, and especially the New Testament, into a Marxist moral theory, whether they mean to or not, whether they use the term Marxism or not. And objectivists are just seeing that and responding accordingly.
Likewise, I have some understanding for Christians who are confused about this issue. Because, first of all, there's this history of being taught that it means a certain thing. But even if you're just looking at the Bible and you had just approached it from scratch and never heard anything about Christianity, this thing in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, it's difficult. You have to read the full context to understand how it's to be applied in what sense and why. This teaching of pathological altruism demands that love be divorced from values, and he rejects that, and I agree with him. Top of the next page, if a good man turns bad, one acknowledges reality by reversing your former estimate of him. The same applies if a man that's bad turns good. But before you forgive somebody, he says that it should be earned. Now, Christians have a well-developed theory of forgiveness. And this is an important and a unique idea within Christianity. So let's see what Objectivism says about forgiveness. He says, forgiveness in moral issues is earned if the guilty party makes restitution to his victim, assuming this is applicable, and then demonstrates objectively through word and deed that he understands the roots of his moral breach. He has reformed his character. He will not commit such wrong again. Now, Objectivism has no theory for how the wrongs can be ultimately atoned for, the way that we do with the gospel, with the blood of Jesus. In Objectivism, they would say, say you stole from somebody, you could confess, you could make it right. But if you killed somebody, they don't really have a place for forgiveness for that kind of thing. At least in many cases they wouldn't. Within Christianity, we have the belief that Jesus says that if you don't have forgiveness towards the people that wronged you, how can you approach God and ask him to forgive you? You'd be like that hypocritical servant that was repaid a great debt, but then refused to forgive a very small debt. If you understand what forgiveness is, if you understand the principle of forgiveness in the Christian context, you must be willing to forgive others. But the application of that, there could be a debate about whether or not you should tell somebody that you forgive them if they have never confessed, or whether it even is applicable to say, I forgive this person in my heart if they have never confessed. That's something that I've heard people argue either way in Christianity. Maybe forgiveness is only for when somebody confesses, versus the alternative argument would be, forgive them, Father, they know not what they do, says Jesus on the cross, or something like that from Stephen, the first martyr. It's appropriate as Christians to follow that model and to pray that God would forgive people. That probably is the answer to the question, but I don't know. Anybody have thoughts on that?
I think the principle in Christianity is that forgiveness is for the repentant.
Pray for them to repent and be forgiven.
Yes. And that can become difficult when we think about our relationship to God and then our relationship to other people in terms of forgiveness. God forgives us prior to repentance in our theology because he elects us and regenerates us, washes us in the blood of his Son, atones for our sins, forgives us, declares us just prior to repentance. He causes the repentance based on those things. But he does so knowing that he will cause us to repent. There will be no instance of Jesus forgiving the sins of somebody who does not ultimately repent. Even with between God and man, forgiveness is exclusively for those who are repentant. It's just the chronology might seem a little bit out of order because we're dealing with a God who is outside of time. And so it's a little bit different. When we talk about human to human relationships, it should be the same way, only we have a different epistemological context. We don't know whether someone is going to repent. Our attitude, I think, should be, I will forgive them if and when they repent. And I pray that God forgives them by bringing them to repentance, but not I forgive them in spite of the lack of my knowledge of their repentance. If someone has committed a grave error, a grave injustice, and to your knowledge they have not repented, I don't think it's appropriate for the Christian to say, I forgive them.
You notice that within the history of Christianity, those who are on the premise of pathological altruism, they would be the ones that would say, oh yes, it's my moral responsibility to forgive, even apart from any reason to. And they treat that as an act of self-sacrifice on their part, and they treat that as therefore being good. You could make a case for it if you twisted a whole bunch of things all at the same time. They all sort of line up together, don't they? All right, let's go to the next section. Peikoff writes, when a man commits an evil like a major robbery or a deception, to say nothing of worse crimes, it's difficult to know even what evidence would be required to convince others of his reform. And so Jacob mentioned the epistemological perspective here. How can you know that somebody really reformed? And say there was a pastor who was abusing children. Should that pastor be allowed to continue working as a pastor if he claims he's reformed? No, there's just no epistemological justification for ever trusting him again. There never will be. Not on the earth, not in this life. You apply that to moral breaches of pastors. That's important.
Let me add, a truly morally reformed or morally repentant person in that, if it's a pastor or whatever, would acknowledge that fact, would acknowledge that you have no reason to believe, you have no way of knowing whether you can trust me with children ever again. He shouldn't even ask or desire to be trusted with children. He would be expecting non-objectivity on the part of other men.
Right. And you compare that with what you see from people like John Crist, who, oh yeah, he's a famous Christian comedian and he's been bedding women, and then it comes out and then he's like, okay, well, I guess I better hide for 2 years. And then he comes back after 2 years. Well, I've been resuscitated. And now he's back in public doing all this stuff. Or, these megachurch pastors. It's really sad that this is what Christianity is in the public mind at this point, is people that are hypocrites. They live just like everybody else that's not a Christian, but they claim to be different, but they really aren't. It's a horrible witness. I would argue that if somebody is using their position as a pastor in order to bed women or in order to be sexually immoral, that is, in almost all cases, going to be the kind of thing that should just disqualify them from ministry, at least public leadership, publicly being recognized as a pastor. It would just disqualify them indefinitely. Let's go forward. Forgiveness, which is legitimate when earned, must be distinguished from mercy. If justice is the policy of identifying a man's deserts and acting accordingly, mercy is the policy of identifying them and not acting accordingly. So he doesn't like mercy. Objectivism doesn't really have much of a category for mercy. That's different from Christianity. So mercy substitutes for justice a dose of the undeserved and does so in the name of pity. Again, it's this appeal to need.
To be fair to Christianity, I don't think Peikoff's view or Rand's view of Christianity in regard to mercy is accurate here.
Right.
Because Christianity does not just ignore the injustice. It demands that the injustice be punished. It's just punished through Christ rather than the person who is the offender. In the way that they are using the concept of mercy, Christianity doesn't believe in that concept either.
Well said. All right. Well, on the theory of mercy, there's a lot that we could develop, but we should move forward. I'm going to agree with Peikoff when he says that he talks about the practical consequences of mercy, say, as a theory of justice. The practical consequences of mercy in the courtroom is horrifying. And this is what we see today. Oh, this criminal is a helpless product of society. And therefore, we're just going to let them back out to go kill more people, which is what is happening. If you have mercy on the wicked, that's a cruelty toward the innocent. All right, moving forward, we often hear that requiting evil with good works to melt the heart of the wicked, but there is no evidence to support that claim. Compare that with Jean Valjean's character in Les Mis and how the priest at the beginning does give him mercy, that it melts his heart. There may be cases where it does. Until someone has a standard of justice, showing the mercy isn't going to melt their heart. Until someone has an internalized understanding of the need for good, I think it depends on context. And I think that if you look at it within the context of your family, fathers often need to be merciful towards their children and give them more grace than perhaps they've deserved in a certain situation. On a small scale, mercy can do a lot to restore relationships. On a large scale, on a society-wide scale, mercy is not the right principle to operate on. He says no evildoer can be melted so long as his victims compete with one another in offering him favors, their sanction, and the other cheek. I would just point out that there's a lot of TV shows coming from Disney right now, or movies from Disney. They sort of assume that if just one person does one good thing towards somebody, it'll melt their heart. It's ridiculous because it breaks the logic of the stories. It makes no sense with the motivations of the characters. It's a dishonest narrator that would tell a story that says that one person doing one deed of kindness to this one other person could change their heart, and then therefore that everything is okay. No, the person's still completely evil. The lack of philosophy leads to broken art and useless art. Next section, like all religions, he says Christianity is incompatible ultimately with every virtue. And here I'm just laughing. This is not a serious engagement with Christianity. I mean, sure, he's making a polemical remark. He says that Christianity seems to take a special pride in its principled exhortation to injustice. If you've studied Christianity, you'll understand that Christianity takes justice very seriously. The entire theme of the Christian story is God taking justice seriously. Let's go to the next section. He describes the key to our age. Egalitarianism. This theory of egalitarianism, that everybody ought to have the same outcomes, is the key to understanding our age. It is the key motive driving the social justice warriors. And on this, he is right. Egalitarianism means that equality supersedes justice. This is the theory of the communists, and this is the theory that is winning in the world today. Peikoff writes, egalitarianism is the act of kicking the scale from the hands of the statue of justice while stripping it of its blindfold, leaving men to be ruled not by ordinary prejudice, which is bad enough, but by the most virulent kind, prejudice, which is the hatred of the good for being the good. That is egalitarianism. Rand has an important essay on this topic. It's called The Age of Envy, and she talks about the hatred of intelligence, of beauty, of ability, virtue, technology, happiness, the metaphysical rage for its own sake, and she rightly identifies that as being nihilism. All right, we go to the next section, productiveness as the adjustment of nature to man. And here we'll have to go shorter just because of how long the video has gone today. But productiveness, she is identified as being the main orientation of a rational man. Productiveness is the process of creating material values, whether goods or services. Man has survival needs. You have to conceive of what that is, and then you have to go create it. And the only alternative for a man would be to be a parasite. Peikoff writes that man survives by adjusting his background to himself. Animals would perish if the environment is not right for them, but men can build dams. Men can write the Constitution, protect themselves in the legal environment. There's no limit to man's need of wealth, and therefore of creative work. Intellectually, every discovery contributes to human life by enhancing man's grasp of reality. Existentially, every material achievement contributes to human life by making it increasingly secure, prolonged, and pleasurable. So there is no human life that is safe enough, knowledgeable enough, rich enough, affluent enough, enjoyable enough, not if man's life is the standard of value. Skip ahead just a little bit on that. He talks about the aspect of productivity in your mind and then in existence. In conventional philosophical thought, there has been this divide where people have said that you can be active in your mind, but it's really for its own sake. He rejects the idea of separating mental activity for its own sake. He says all mental activity needs to be connected to tangible results that help you survive. He talks about how the ivory tower tends to disdain the practical world, and that's not healthy. We're on 294, talks about the mind-body integration that we discussed in the past. Because of the principle that we are a mind and a body and an integrated being, we must move from whatever intellectual products that we begin to dream of to putting them into the world, whether that means writing a book, delivering a lecture, building something, starting a company, those kinds of things. He says there has to be this connection between science and technology. We've discussed these topics in the past because they've come up in the past. If you were to have science without technology, that would be purposeless. If you were to have technology without science, that would be impossible. We connect the mind to the needs of reality. And he talks about the source of today's wealth is the Industrial Revolution. Its cause was two earlier developments, the Renaissance, which is the philosophic revolution in favor of this world, and then another thing is the discovery of man's rights, which would take place in the Age of Reason and the Enlightenment. So reason and freedom. The reason of restoring Aristotle through the work of Aquinas, and then freedom, giving people the ability to produce. He says that the effect was an outpouring of abundance. And this is something that you can see almost like history is a test case for it. The societies that learned to value reason and freedom became wealthy. The societies that didn't, did not. Peikoff points out that this wealth is a profound moral value if it is understood as coming from the mind and coming from people living freely by their own choice. That's moral. Go to page 296. Rand writes, all work is an act of creating. It comes from the same source, from an inviolate capacity to see through one's own eyes. He writes that a coal mine operator who turns out some coal, or a sweeper in a mine who stays in focus, is productively and spiritually miles above the composer who discovers from the universities and then docilely concocts the kind of noise that has been authorized for the nonce as avant-garde. Honest work is worth more than dishonest work of any kind, is his point here. All fields of proper human work involve some kind of using your mind to figure out what is the way to solve the problem and getting it done. Peikoff points out that Rand methodically rejects the mind-body dichotomy. A productive man is a moral man. At the bottom of 297, productiveness is not only a necessary element of the good life, it is the good life's central purpose. Next page, the principle of purpose means conscious goal-directedness in every aspect of one's existence. Peikoff writes, he is the person with a passionate ambition for values who wants every moment and step of his life to count in their service. You're allowed to relax. I'm not saying that you can't relax, but you have to have everything oriented and integrated to your purpose in your life. Your central purpose has to be something that's long range. Peikoff writes on 299. Has to be the ruling standard of your daily actions. Because if you have this central purpose, then you can integrate all of your actions. You have some way to decide what's good and what's not, what belongs in your life, what doesn't. Top of 300. The producer moves through his days not in random circles, but in a straight line. We're not primarily moved by social purposes, but by the designs of our own production, our own need to be producers. So Peikoff writes at the top of 301, social relationships are an important value, but only within the appropriate context. Recreation is a value, but only within the appropriate context. You can read what he says there. So productiveness is the substance of your life morally. It's the responsibility of every person, no matter their finances. We've discussed these in the past, so this is not too complicated. He says that motherhood, for example, is productiveness. Managing a home or a house is productiveness. So the moral issue is, do you approach your field of work with this desire to combine what your mind is and what you're creating? Have you picked a field that makes demands of you and you're striving to meet those demands, to do good work, to build on it, to expand your knowledge, develop your ability, improve your efficiency? Every human being, writes Peikoff, has the power to achieve, each on his own level. This is what gives meaning to life. Jennifer, you left a comment, the production theme as moral action is really well articulated and elaborated in Francisco's money speech in Atlas Shrugged. Yeah, well said. All right, well, I'll wrap it up for today. Thank you for joining on the video. And you can see all of our replays at christianintellectual.com/objectivism. Hope to see you guys next week. God bless.